Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of the OKR Q&A Podcast, also known as the OKR Corral. I'm your host, Tim Meinhardt, CEO of Atruity, an OKR consultancy headquartered in our nation's capital. Today, we're so excited to interview Leif Ulstrup. Leif is a confidant and an over 30-year senior-level executive. I've had the pleasure of knowing Leif for almost 8 years. Leif is a recognized thought leader within the Washington, D.C. area. Please welcome Leif Ulstrup. Hey, Leif.
Good morning.
How you doing, baby?
You?
Good.
I'm well.
So, Leif, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background.
So most of my background has been in general manager roles, running profit centers. I started out as a technology developer. I developed programs in Fortran and did work in AI with the Lisp programming language. So I started my career in technology, and then I eventually got into running projects and programs and then profit centers. And then most of my career has been in running increasingly larger profit centers, in doing systems integration type work, both process and business change, and also technology.
Terrific. So you and I had this funny discussion about objectives and key results, actually through email, and I was so surprised that you even knew about objectives and key results, and so our discussions have went from there. But walk me back a little bit and talk to me a little bit about your initial impressions of this methodology called objectives and key results.
Yeah, so I had an opportunity to read the John Doerr Measure What Matters book. I was traveling up, going up to an event up at MIT, and I'm sitting in for breakfast or whatever. I'm sitting reading on my Kindle, and I had picked out the book. I had seen some references to it, that some reviews, and I'm always looking for new innovations in management practices and so forth. And I hadn't gotten more than maybe a quarter through the book, and I thought, wow, this is really got some great ideas in it. And I hadn't realized I had worked years ago with some folks from Google, and they kept talking about the system that they used for their objective setting and feedback system, and it was highly transparent. Everybody had things in Google Sheets inside the company, and everybody could see your goals and how you're doing on a quarterly basis. And I was intrigued with it, but I didn't know much more about it. And then when I read the book, I sort of put two and two together, and I realized, this is the system that they were talking about. And I thought, wow, this is very interesting. So anyway, that's what triggered my interest in it, and I thought it had a lot of valuable ideas. I'm always looking for either emerging technologies or new business practices or management or techniques and so forth, both in the work that I've done as a leader, but also when I'm helping advise clients.
Yeah, Leif, we had a very similar experience. I was turned on to the book Measure What Matters by a friend of mine, and I got a third of the way through the book and went, oh, this thing is really, 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 really innovative. And, I like the agile nature of it as well. And it was just to me, I found it to be an exciting book just to learn a little bit about what it was and what people were thinking about a decade or more ago on how to be able to build a fast growth company and what the importance of goal setting was to the development and success of those organizations.
Well, one of the things that goes back to ideas, John Doerr got the ideas from his experience at Intel working for Andy Grove, who is somebody I really admire. But Andy Grove also got a lot of those ideas from Peter Drucker, who's somebody who's my management hero. So
right,
and so it's interesting to see how different ideas have turned into these innovative approaches.
Right, and you and I in our first flurry of emails, you said, Tim, I've actually been doing a small project with objectives and key results, and walk us through a little bit about what you felt were the largest challenges in getting started for any group with objectives and key results.
I think just one of the hard parts is just formulating what those objectives should be. Because you start to write them down and you start thinking about, well, how do I frame them? How do I phrase them? And when you think about how the process works, you're going to share them with everybody. So it's a little different when maybe you have a set of, Peter Drucker always emphasized the management by objectives, and maybe you have a one-sheeter with your boss that explains what you're doing. But now all of a sudden, no, this is going to be in a spreadsheet, or it's going to be in a presentation that everybody can look at. Well, maybe I need to spend a little more time. How do I want to formulate those? And if I'm at a fairly senior level, the way that I construct those is going to how to construct them is going to set a tone for the entire organization. So if I am too conservative in how I frame them, or if they're too aspirational, too abstract, or whatever it might be, it could have a pretty big impact on how people perceive what is it you want to do. And I think just that can be difficult to formulate those.
It absolutely is, and it works a part of your brain that you're not necessarily always asked to work. And so my experience has been in working with managers that, at first they're looking for the key, like what's the quick answer here? And, and the quick answer is it takes a little bit of time just to think it through. And we work with probing questions, and those are extremely difficult to ask of yourself sometimes.
Yes. Almost impossible. I think that's the power of the whole thing, is the reflection aspect, both when you formulate them to begin with, but then that quarterly reflecting and learning, and it's a very powerful approach, but it does force you to spend more time reflecting than a lot of managers really want to do.
Yeah.
Or have time to do, actually.
Well, it's true, but yet everybody says the same thing. Geez, I feel so much more comfortable now that I've talked this out. That's exactly what I was thinking. And so, and you go, well, yes, it is. That's what we've come up with.
That's good.
So, Leif, share with us a little bit about what, and you even talked about your son doing this, but I'm interested in hearing a little bit about what you think has been your largest success story that you'd love to be able to share with the audience about objectives and key results.
Well, I think probably the most successful thing I've seen is clients starting to have more of a dialogue. The clients that sponsor me as an advisor to them, just engaging in a dialogue with their direct reports, and their ability then to exchange more clarity about what they're looking for, and not just for the next month or the next quarter, but thinking out, okay, where are we going to be as a business in the next 2, 3, 4 years? And that dialogue, I think, is really the key element to all this. The mechanics of the process can, there's in a large organization can be, a lot of work, and you do, help clients to figure out how to go about implementing that. But I think that the initial dialogue and exchange, it also reveals, one of the things that clients have said to me is it reveals aspirational goals of their staff that they weren't aware of. Until they started having these conversations, because unlike a typical goal setting that's more financially driven or sales driven, well, okay, we have some number and then somebody allocates that number to you. Well, okay, I got to figure out how to close that gap. But this is a little different, because you're being asked to think about what kind of contribution can my organization make to the success of the whole. And it goes beyond just, okay, there's the number or whatever you're being held accountable in terms of revenue or budget or something, but gets you thinking more about what is the, what's the nature of the group that you're running, and what are the things that you can do that have maybe meet higher level goals that have been set. I mean, the example John Doerr uses is, a football team trying to get into, they want to get into the playoffs, or they want to get into the Super Bowl, right? And, if you're in marketing, it's one thing. If you're selling seats, or if you're somebody who's, the offensive, coach or something, they all have different roles to play and contributions to make. And I think it forces you to think about that and reflect on it in a way. And that's what I've heard from clients, is the dialogue they're having with their direct reports is much more meaningful dialogue. And I think there's nothing but good that can come from that. I think, we're in such a world where people are overwhelmed with information coming at them on a day-to-day basis, especially in larger organizations, that they don't have the time to have those conversations, have that kind of dialogue, and this forces it. And I think it's constructive.
Well, thank you. That was fantastic.
So,
let's say that you do have this conversation with an organization, and they're considering starting objectives and key results. Leif, tell me a little bit about what advice you might give them as they begin to look down this path of performance management.
But probably the most important thing is that if they do it, they ought to start relatively, sort of a small approach amongst, and it's got to start with the leader showing the way. This is not something that I'm going to implement it and I'll just have somebody over, some direct report take responsibility for it. The leader has to be the central point of rolling this out. And so I think you have to make a commitment that you're willing to spend the time. And then a big part of the key to this is the quarterly time to reflect. We thought we could do X, but we only got half of X done. Right. You got to spend some of the time. Why, right? So the value of this is then looking at, we set certain objectives and key results, and on the key results, if we're not meeting those, this is not necessarily, many of them are not traditional business measures that, might just be sales for the month or something like that. A lot of these are things which are probably more abstract, problems that you're working on, harder problems that you're working on.
Sure.
And so you have to be willing to commit the time to do the reflection and then do the planning for the next quarter. And a lot of folks, they're intrigued with the idea, but they may not be ready to devote that kind of time. And if they're not, I think they're probably not the right organization at that point. They've got to find a place and time and a reason that they'd be willing to do that. Because this is all, I always think about this concept of working on the business and working in the business. And most people are working in the business, meeting their numbers or whatever it is, running the operations, getting something processed. But that time working on the business, which is what these are all about, you have to be willing to carve out a fair amount of time. And I think the benefits are potentially significant, but a lot of folks, that I think is the key starting thing, is that you've got to be willing to do that.
Yep, I couldn't agree with you more. All right, so kind of last question here, Leif.
Yeah.
So what was the burning question that you had about objectives and key results when you got started even learning about this and doing things with it that you'd want to be able to provide us with the answer?
Well, so I don't know if I have the answer, but the thing that I was curious about is who this would necessarily resonate with. Right. What type of leader? Because lots of times I have been in management and management consulting for most of my career, and there's always some new fad. There's been some new thing that in fact, actually, one of the fads in the mid '90s was Peter Singe's learning organization, which is everybody was talking about, but no one knew how to implement it. And in looking at these OKRs, I realized they're actually a good implementation of those concepts. But lots of times, these ideas that come along only resonate with a portion of leaders. And I was curious about whether this was, this would end up being just kind of a, little fad and, come and go, and who would it resonate with? And I've been surprised. I mean, you and I talked about this a few times ago in the last couple of years. I think this has much more staying power because I think he did a very good job, John Doerr, in his book, explaining how this has powered so many iconic companies we have today, especially that are the fast-growing .com companies. And so I think that has given some credence to the value of this that some of the other techniques didn't necessarily have. So I think probably the thing that I think it's a broader base of executives are resonating with this than I realized. And I think once people start to realize this gets them back to the basics of being a leader as opposed to just being a manager. Correct. And I think that's what I think is where the power of this is in helping you to think about how to lead as opposed to just, I think about managers kind of keeping things in control, right? They define a system, control it, whereas this is not a control system. Most companies have a lot of control systems. This is a leadership thing, right? It's the working on the business. And so I think the question I had in mind, would this be broadly, or is this just like kind of one of those things?
Quick fad, quick pop. Yeah.
Yeah. So my sense is I think this appeals to a broader set of leaders, and I'm hopeful that this will become something that was is broadly adopted. I mean, one of the previous things that I was always fascinated with, a lot of like lean thinking, the Toyota production system.